She was 21 years old, and she had exactly $6, a dead father's pocket watch, and no roof left to call her own. Her stepmother, a hard, calculating woman named Ruth Pemberton, had sold the family boarding house out from under her not 4 days after her father's burial, telling the town of Larkspur Junction, Wyoming, that a stepdaughter had no more claim to a dead man's property than a hired girl, and that Josephine Ames would do well to find work elsewhere before winter closed the passes. With that $6, and a stubbornness that had carried her through worse than this, Josephine walked out along the old dead spur of track behind the freight yard and bought, for $4 from the railroad's own dismissive clerk, the rusted salvage rights to a single locked boxcar that had sat abandoned on that forgotten siding for 40 years, sealed since before the war's last cannon had gone quiet, its papers lost, its owner unknown, its door welded shut by rust and time, and something the town had long since stopped wondering about. Every soul in Larkspur Junction told her she had spent her last coin on a coffin of iron and cobwebs. They did not know that behind that rusted seal waited a truth that would not only save Josephine Ames from ruin, but would return to an entire railroad town something it had been quietly cheated of for 4 decades. Settle in and let us tell you the story of Josephine Ames. If you have ever felt like something forgotten and left to rust, we hope you'll tell us so in the comments, because we have come to believe that the things the world abandons are so very rarely as empty as they appear. Josephine had been raised on the sound of trains, in a boarding house that stood so close to the Larkspur Junction depot that the walls shivered gently every time the eastbound freight came through. And she had learned, almost before she learned her letters, to read the rhythm of the rails the way other children learned the rhythm of church bells. Her father, Elias Ames, had come west in the great building years after the war to lay track for the Union Pacific Line, one of the thousands of anonymous men whose sweat had stitched the country together rail by rail. And he had settled at last in Larkspur Junction, not because the town was beautiful, for it was not, being little more than a huddle of clapboard buildings against a windswept stretch of high plains, but because the junction itself, where the transcontinental line met a smaller branch spur running north toward the coalfields, meant steady work for a man handy, with a hammer and an honest tongue. Elias married late, to a gentle schoolteacher named Constance, who gave him Josephine, and then, within the year, gave her own life to a fever that swept the junction the winter Josephine turned 3, leaving father and daughter to raise each other in the practical, tender way of people who have no one else. Elias Ames was not a wealthy man, nor an educated one beyond his letters and his figures, but he possessed a quality Josephine came to understand, only much later, was rarer and more valuable than either wealth or schooling. He could not abide waste. He salvaged what other men threw away, mended what other men discarded, and taught his daughter from her earliest years that value was not a fixed thing stamped onto an object by its maker, but something that revealed itself only to a person patient enough to look properly. He kept the boarding house running on cast-off furniture rescued from the depot's lost and unclaimed shed, taught Josephine to reupholster a chair from a bolt of remnant cloth bought for pennies, taught her to read a rusted tool and know, by the weight and the grain of the metal, whether it could be saved with oil and patience, or was truly beyond mending. It was, in its way, an education as thorough as any offered in the fine schools back east, though it never once involved a proper classroom, and Josephine absorbed it the way a child absorbs anything taught with love, without ever quite realizing how deeply it had shaped her. It was old Wendell Trask, the depot's longtime freight agent, a stooped and endlessly patient man who had worked the Larkspur Junction yard since before the rails had properly connected the coasts, who first told Josephine, as a girl of perhaps 10, the legend of the dead spur car. Every railroad town has its ghost story, Wendell used to say. settling his weight against the depot's sun-warmed siding, while Josephine sat cross-legged in the cinders listening. And Larkspur Junction's ghost story was the locked boxcar sitting alone on the abandoned northern siding, its markings worn illegible, its heavy door sealed with a lead customs seal gone green with age, forgotten there since the chaos of the war years when so many freight manifests had simply vanished along with the men who'd written them. Nobody living, Wendell told her, could say for certain what railroad had sent it, what it carried, or why it had been left to rust on a track that led nowhere at all, though he had his own theory, offered always with a wink, that it held nothing more exciting than a shipment of spoiled harness leather too worthless for anyone to bother hauling away. Josephine, even as a child, had found herself doubting that explanation, though she could not have said why, only that something about a sealed door left untouched for so many years seemed to argue for more than spoiled leather. Her father died in the autumn of 1906, crushed beneath a shifting stack of ties in a yard accident that the railroad's insurance man called, with chilling brevity, an unavoidable misfortune. And it was in her grief that Josephine first truly understood how precarious her position in the world had become. For Elias had remarried 3 years earlier to Ruth Pemberton, a widow from Cheyenne with sharp eyes and a sharper sense of what was owed her. And the boarding house, though built and furnished largely by Elias's own hands and Josephine's own labor, was legally his wife's the moment he was laid in the ground. Ruth had never pretended to any great warmth toward her stepdaughter, tolerating her presence chiefly because Elias's steady wages made the arrangement convenient, and with Elias gone, Ruth saw no further reason for convenience. She informed Josephine, with a briskness that did not even trouble to disguise itself as regret, that the boarding house would be sold to a hotel concern out of Cheyenne, that the sale was already well underway, and that Josephine, being of age and unmarried, ought to consider herself fortunate to be given a full week to find other arrangements before the new owners arrived to take possession. The fall, when the final blow landed, was almost anticlimactic in its cruelty, precisely because Josephine had half expected it for weeks and had already begun, in the quiet way of someone raised to salvage rather than despair, to take inventory of what she still possessed. It was distressingly little. Ruth had been thorough in claiming every stick of furniture and every dish as her own, insisting, not entirely without legal grounding, that everything within the boarding house's walls had been purchased with household funds that were rightfully hers as widow. And Josephine found herself, on the appointed morning, standing on the depot platform with a single trunk containing her clothes, her mother's small Bible, her father's pocket watch, which Ruth had grudgingly allowed her to keep only because it bore no resale value worth arguing over, and $6 that represented every cent Josephine had managed to save from years of taking in mending on the side. She might have simply boarded the next eastbound train and gone to seek work in Cheyenne or beyond, as several of the town's more practical women advised her to do. But something in Josephine balked at leaving Larkspur Junction entirely. Some stubborn thread of her father's own refusal to abandon a thing simply because it had been declared worthless. She was standing on that platform turning the problem over in her mind, watching old Wendell Trask, now bent nearly double with age but still working the freight desk out of sheer habit, when he mentioned, almost in passing, that the railroad's district office had finally, after 40 years of simply ignoring the matter, decided to clear the northern siding entirely to make way for a proposed new spur line, and that the salvage rights to the old dead boxcar, along with several other abandoned freight cars nobody had claimed in decades, were being sold off cheap to whoever would take the scrap value off the company's hands and haul the wreckage away. It was, Josephine would later admit, as much her father's voice in her memory as any careful reasoning that made her walk into the railroad's small district office that same afternoon and ask, with a steadiness she did not entirely feel, what the company wanted for the old sealed car on the dead spur specifically. The clerk, a young man new enough to the position to find the whole business faintly amusing, informed her that the car was scrap and nothing more. Its lading long since presumed lost or spoiled, its lock rusted solid, and that if she was fool enough to want it, $4 would cover the salvage claim, and the company would consider it entirely her problem thereafter. Josephine paid him 4 of her 6 remaining dollars without allowing herself time to reconsider, walked the mile out along the weed-choked northern siding in the last gray light of that October afternoon, and stood for a long while simply looking up at the car that had haunted the edges of her childhood imagination, its wood siding silvered and split with age, its lead seal, exactly as Wendell had always described it, still fused unbroken across the heavy sliding door. It took her the better part of 3 days, working alone with a borrowed crowbar and a persistence that drew curious and pitying looks from the few townsfolk who passed that way, to finally break the ancient seal and force the swollen door along its rusted track. And when at last it gave way with a shriek of protesting metal that she felt in her back teeth, the smell that rolled out to meet her was not the rot and ruin she had braced herself for, but something drier and stranger, a scent of old paper and cedar, and something faintly metallic beneath it. The car's interior, once her eyes adjusted to the gloom, proved to hold not spoiled leather or worthless scrap, as Wendell had always joked, but row upon row of wooden crates, stacked with a careful precision that spoke of someone who had loaded that car with real purpose, and stenciled across the nearest crate, in lettering gone faint but still legible, were words that made Josephine's breath catch entirely. Property of the Frontier Mining Consortium, payroll shipment, consigned care of Larkspur Junction depot agent. She did not touch the crates that first evening, some instinct for caution as old as her father's own careful habits holding her back. But she returned the following morning with a lantern and the patience her father had drilled into her since childhood. And it was in the smaller of the crates, tucked near the front of the car where a shipping clerk might have placed the most important papers for easy access, that she found what would occupy the whole of her attention for weeks to come. A leather dispatch case, remarkably well preserved by the car's dry, sealed interior, containing a thick sheaf of documents, ledgers, and a single unsent letter addressed simply to the depot agent. Larkspur Junction, dated in the careful hand of a company paymaster and marked with a date in the spring of 1866, the very year, Josephine realized with a chill that the war's chaos had only just begun to settle into an uneasy peace. The ledgers, once Josephine spread them across the floor of the old car and began the slow work of deciphering their faded ink, told a story far larger and far sadder than any spoiled shipment of leather. The Frontier Mining Consortium, it emerged, had operated a coal camp some 15 miles north of Larkspur Junction in the years immediately following the war, employing several hundred men, many of them former soldiers on both sides of that terrible conflict, who had drifted west with nothing but their labor to offer, alongside a considerable number of newly freed men seeking honest wages in a country still deciding what freedom would actually mean in practice. The ledgers recorded, in the same meticulous detail her own father might have admired, 3 full months of unpaid wages owed to those miners, a sum that had been loaded onto this very car in gold and silver coin for shipment north along the branch spur, only for the shipment to arrive, according to the paymaster's own increasingly frantic notations, at Larkspur Junction and simply stop, diverted onto the dead siding under circumstances the ledger's final entries described only, obliquely as irregularities in the consignment arrangements requiring the depot agent's urgent clarification. The unsent letter, when Josephine finally worked up the courage to open it, explained what the ledger had only hinted at. The company paymaster, a man named Cyrus Holloway, had written to warn the Larkspur Junction depot agent of the time that a considerable sum was en route and must under no circumstances be released except upon proper written authorization, having apparently grown suspicious, in the confused final months of the war's aftermath, that certain parties along the rail line were exploiting the general chaos to divert unclaimed shipments for their own profit. The letter was never sent, its intended recipient never warned, because Holloway himself, as a final grim notation in a different later hand recorded, had died of cholera in a camp epidemic before he could follow the shipment north to confirm its safe arrival. And in the confusion that followed, with the mining camp itself failing within the year as the coal seam proved thinner than promised and the miners scattered in search of other work, the matter of 3 months' unpaid wages simply vanished into the general chaos of a young country still stitching itself back together. The car itself apparently sealed and abandoned by whoever had diverted it, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of simple caution, and then quietly forgotten as the years piled on top of the mystery like dust on the crates themselves. Josephine sat a long while that evening, with Holloway's unsent letter open on her knee, the lantern guttering low, feeling something that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, but a clean, hard clarity she recognized as entirely her father's own. She was not merely Ruth Pemberton's discarded stepdaughter anymore. $6 poorer for a foolish purchase the whole town pitied her for. She was, quite possibly, the only living person who could finally answer a question that had waited 40 years in the dark. What had actually become of the Frontier Mining Consortium's stolen payroll? And who in Larkspur Junction had made it disappear? She did not act rashly, understanding, as her father had taught her through every patient hour of salvage work. That haste ruined more good material than any amount of honest weathering ever did. She spent the following weeks quietly, cross-referencing the ledger's names against what records still survived at the Larkspur Junction depot itself. Old Wendell Trask proving an unexpectedly valuable ally once she confided a careful portion of what she had found. For Wendell's own memory, though his body had grown frail, remained sharp enough to recall that the depot agent serving in that particular spring of 1866 had been a man named Silas Pruitt, and that Pruitt's family, remarkably enough, still held considerable standing in Larkspur Junction to this day. His grandson Harmon Pruitt, now serving as the town's bank president, and the very man, as it happened, who had recently arranged the sale of Ruth Pemberton's boarding house to the Cheyenne Hotel concern, taking a tidy commission for his trouble. The coincidence struck Josephine at first as too neat to be entirely believable, but as she dug further, quietly examining old property records at the county courthouse under the pretense of researching her father's estate, she found a pattern that could not be so easily dismissed. Silas Pruitt, depot agent in 1866 with a modest government salary, had somehow purchased, within 18 months of the mining payroll's disappearance, a substantial tract of prime land bordering the junction itself. Land that had grown, over the following 4 decades, into the foundation of the Pruitt family's considerable and respected fortune. A fortune that had built the very bank Harmon Pruitt now presided over with such civic pride. It was, Josephine realized with a mixture of vindication and unease, very likely that the entire prosperous Pruitt legacy that Larkspur Junction so admired had been built, quite literally, on wages stolen from several hundred coal miners who had never received a cent of what they were owed. Men and their families who had scattered west and south in the wake of the camp's collapse. Many of them, Josephine suspected from the ledger's list of names, freedmen who would have had precious little recourse to demand justice even had they known where to look for it. Word of Josephine's activities out at the Dead Spur did not remain quiet for long in a town the size of Larkspur Junction. And it was perhaps 5 weeks into her painstaking research that Harmon Pruitt himself, a smooth and civically prominent man in his middle 40s, whose bank held the mortgage on nearly every business in town, called on Josephine at the small rented room above the Mercantile where she had been lodging since her eviction from the boarding house. He was, as she had expected from his reputation, unfailingly courteous, expressing polite concern that a young woman alone had been spending so much time poking about a dangerous, rotting old freight car, and offering, with the easy generosity of a man accustomed to solving problems with money, to purchase her salvage claim to the car and its contents for the surprisingly generous sum of $50, framing it as simple civic kindness toward the daughter of a respected junction man. Josephine, who had by then read Cyrus Holloway's unsent letter enough times to have it nearly memorized, understood precisely what Pruitt feared she might already know, and declined his offer with a politeness that cost her considerable effort to maintain, watching something flicker and harden behind his pleasant civic smile that told her, more surely than any confession, that her careful research had found its mark. Pruitt did not take the refusal gracefully, though he was far too practiced a man of business to show it openly. Within the following 2 weeks, Josephine found the Mercantile owner suddenly and apologetically unable to extend her further credit for mending supplies, found a county surveyor abruptly questioning whether her salvage claim to the car had been properly filed, hinting that the whole purchase might be voided on a technicality that would return the car and its mysterious contents cleanly to the railroad company, and found, most alarmingly, that Wendell Trask, her one true ally at the depot, was quietly informed by the railroad's district superintendent that his continued employment, offered as something of a courtesy to an elderly man well past his useful years, might need reconsidering if he continued assisting Josephine's inquiries. It became plain to Josephine that Harmon Pruitt held enough entangled influence over the bank, the county surveyor's office, and the railroad's own local management to make her position genuinely precarious, and that he intended, through entirely deniable and respectable means, to see her salvage claim voided, and her dangerous knowledge quietly buried before she could prove anything solid enough to threaten 4 decades of carefully built Pruitt respectability. It was Wendell Trask himself, risking the very position Pruitt had threatened, who reminded Josephine of something her own father used to say about salvaging metal, that rust could disguise a great deal on the surface, but the maker's stamp beneath it, once properly cleaned and examined, could never truly lie about where a thing had come from. Handwriting, Josephine realized, turning that old wisdom over through a sleepless night, was no different, and Silas Pruitt, dead now some 15 years, had nonetheless left behind, in the county's own dusty land records, his original signature on the deed purchasing that suspicious tract of land in 1867. A signature Josephine now compared with painstaking care against a sample of Cyrus Holloway's own hand from the recovered ledgers, confirming what she had already begun to suspect, that a brief additional notation in the ledger's final pages, one she had initially assumed was simply Holloway's own hasty scrawl, in fact matched Silas Pruitt's distinctive hand exactly. An admission, however guarded, that the depot agent himself had intercepted and redirected the payroll shipment onto the dead siding under his own authority, using the general confusion of Holloway's death and the war's chaotic aftermath to ensure the theft would never be properly traced. Armed with the ledgers, Holloway's unsent letter, the land records, and this final damning comparison of hands, Josephine did not attempt to confront Harmon Pruitt alone in his own bank, understanding as her father had always understood the wisdom of not walking unarmed into another man's fortress. She traveled instead the considerable distance to the territorial land office and, more importantly, to the offices of a traveling federal claims attorney who happened to be passing through the territory investigating unrelated matters of veterans' pensions, a careful, unhurried man named Augustus Reed, who listened to Josephine's full account with a growing and genuine interest, recognizing immediately that unpaid wages owed to men who had served their country, many of them veterans of the very war whose aftermath had swallowed their pay, constituted precisely the sort of righted wrong his office existed to pursue. Reed's involvement, once secured, changed the entire complexion of Josephine's fight. For a federal attorney's letter of inquiry to the Larkspur Junction Bank carried a weight that no amount of local influence could easily dismiss or intimidate into silence. The reckoning that followed, when it finally came, unfolded with considerably more public attention than Larkspur Junction's gossips had seen in a generation. Though Josephine, mindful of her father's own quiet dignity, took no particular satisfaction in the spectacle of it. Harmon Pruitt was summoned to account for his grandfather's 40-year-old theft before a formal territorial inquiry. The Ledgers and Holloway's letter and the damning handwriting comparison laid out with methodical patience by Attorney Reed, and though the elder Silas Pruitt was long past any earthly justice, the inquiry determined that the considerable fortune he had built upon that stolen payroll, a fortune that had passed down intact to fund his grandson's bank and standing, constituted an unjust enrichment that could, and under federal pressure regarding the veterans' claims involved, would be substantially recovered for the benefit of the original wronged parties or their surviving descendants. Harmon Pruitt did not go to prison, for the theft itself belonged to a dead man beyond the reach of any court, but he was compelled to surrender a considerable portion of the bank's own capital and the disputed land itself in restitution, and watched, in the space of a single humiliating season, the polished civic reputation his family had spent 4 decades cultivating dissolve into something the town would whisper about for years to come. The payroll itself, the gold and silver coin still sealed in those 40-year-old crates, proved upon careful federal accounting to be worth considerably more than its original face value once its historical significance and the accumulated claims of interest were properly reckoned. And Josephine, working now alongside Attorney Reed's office, spent the better part of that following spring helping to trace what descendants could still be found of the scattered mining camp workers, a task that led her correspondence as far as Kansas and Missouri, and even, in a few remarkable cases, to the descendants of freedmen who had gone on to build modest but hard-won lives, never knowing that a debt from their grandfather's era had finally, patiently, come due. Josephine kept for herself only the modest $4 her original salvage purchase and considerable labor had genuinely earned under the law, a sum so restrained that Attorney Reed himself gently urged her to accept more. But Josephine, remembering her father's own unwavering insistence that a person take only what was rightfully theirs and not a penny more, declined, finding a satisfaction in that restraint that felt more like her father's presence than any amount of coin ever could. What remained after every traceable claim had been honored, and there was, even after so many decades and so much careful searching, a considerable sum that could not be definitively returned to any single living heir, Josephine proposed, with the town's own newly humbled leadership now eager to be seen supporting rather than opposing her, be used to establish a proper depot infirmary and a fund for injured railroad workers and their families in Larkspur Junction, so that no family in that town would ever again face what she and her father had faced: an accident, a death, and then simply nothing. No safety net, no recourse, only the cold mercy of whoever controlled the property afterward. The town council, chastened and genuinely moved by the whole affair, approved the measure unanimously. and the small brick building that rose the following summer beside the depot came to be known, at old Wendell Trask's quiet insistence, as the Ames Holloway Fund, honoring both the daughter who had finally opened the seal and the paymaster who had died trying to protect what was inside it. And so we return, as we promised at the beginning, to where this story started, to a 21-year-old woman standing alone on a depot platform with $6 to her name, spending nearly every cent of it on a locked and rusted boxcar the whole town had long ago dismissed as nothing more than a curiosity for old men's ghost stories. It would have been the simplest thing in the world for Josephine Ames to believe what everyone around her seemed so certain of, that she had thrown away her last coins on scrap and superstition, that 40 years of rust and silence had rendered whatever lay behind that seal entirely worthless. But Josephine had been raised by a father who could not abide waste, who taught her with every mended chair and salvaged tool that value does not announce itself loudly to careless eyes, but waits, patient and quiet, for someone willing to look properly. What she found behind that broken seal was never merely coin. It was a debt owed to hundreds of forgotten men who had given their labor and, in some cases, their lives to a young country still learning what it owed its own people. A dignity an entire scattered community had been denied for 4 decades, and proof, quiet but unshakable, that the things the world abandons on dead tracks and forgotten sidings, old freight cars and old ledgers, and yes, young women left with nothing but $6 and their father's stubborn refusal to see anything as truly worthless, are so very rarely as empty as they appear. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Josephine Ames and the sealed car that waited 40 patient years for someone honest enough to break it open. If her story moved you, we hope you will share it with someone who needs reminding that real worth so often hides behind the plainest, most forgotten doors. And we would love to hear your answer to this. What is a time you found something valuable that everyone else had already written off as empty? Tell us in the comments below. And until next time, stay close.